Hey guys, tonight we're doing something a little different. So, if you're curled up in bed right now, maybe with a blanket wrapped around you like a medieval burrito, I invite you to get comfortable and let's drift into the strange, very sleepy, very slightly gross world of how people actually slept in the past. Because here's the thing, the way we sleep today, you know, with your bed frame from IKEA, memory foam mattress, maybe some string lights and a phone screen glowing at 2 a.m., is not at all how most of human history did it. In fact, for most of time, people didn't even think about sleep as one long, solid 8-hour block. That's kind of a modern invention. But don't worry, we'll get there. We'll talk about segmented sleep, strange bedtime rituals, medieval night terrors, and the delightful concept of just casually sharing a bed with everyone you knew. Because privacy, that was a luxury, and so was soap. So, let's float gently back in time. Imagine your bed creaks like an old ship. The air smells faintly of smoke, hay, and possibly pig, and you're about to learn way too much about how our ancestors nodded off. Let's start simple. Where did people actually sleep? If we go all the way back to the Paleolithic, our beloved cavemen days, beds were not really beds. They were piles of leaves, grass, or straw on the cave floor, sometimes with animal skins on top because, surprise, rocks are cold. Archaeologists have found these ancient bedding layers where grass was laid down and, fun fact, people used ash underneath to keep away insects. So yes, even 200,000 years ago, someone was annoyed at bugs crawling on them while they tried to sleep. Relatable. As time shuffled along into early farming societies, sleep setups got fancier, if you consider wooden platforms covered in straw fancy. For most of history, the average person had what was basically a sack filled with straw, sometimes changed seasonally so it wouldn't rot too aggressively. That was your mattress. The frame, if you were lucky, wood. If not, the ground. Now, royalty, of course, always had to overdo it. Ancient Egyptian pharaohs slept on raised wooden beds with carved legs shaped like lion paws, because nothing says, "I'm divine," like pretending to hover over everyone else while your feet don't touch the floor. The mattresses were stuffed with reeds or feathers, and sometimes there were curtains around the bed, not for privacy, but mostly to keep bugs away. Mosquitoes have been ruining nights since the dawn of time, and the Romans, being Romans, took it a step further. Wealthy Romans slept on elevated beds with soft mattresses stuffed with wool or feathers. Poorer Romans, however, usually just curled up on straw mats or even the floor, which, let's be honest, is basically the ancient version of crashing on your friend's futon, except less hygienic. But here's the fun part. Sleep wasn't just about where, it was about how. Today we imagine bedtime as one long 8-hour snooze, but for much of history, people did something called segmented sleep, or first and second sleep. Basically, they'd go to bed not long after sunset, sleep for a few hours, then wake up in the middle of the night. They'd get up, stoke the fire, maybe pray, maybe chat with a neighbor, or do other activities, if you catch my drift. And then, after this midnight intermission, they'd go back to bed for their second sleep. So, if you've ever woken up at 3 a.m. and thought, "Why am I awake? This must mean I'm broken." Actually, congratulations, you just accidentally reenacted medieval sleep. Your ancestors would be proud. Why did people do this? Partly because nights were long, especially in winter, and partly because artificial lighting was minimal, so life revolved around the sun. The idea of forcing yourself into one continuous sleep block didn't really exist until street lighting and industrial schedules forced humans to sync up. Before that, segmented sleep was just normal. And speaking of normal, let's talk about who you slept with. No, not in the fun way. I mean literally, in the bed. For most of history, people shared beds constantly. Families would pile in together. Parents, children, maybe a servant or two. In inns or taverns, it wasn't unusual for strangers to share the same bed. Imagine showing up at a roadside inn after a long day of travel, and the innkeeper casually says, "Oh yes, you'll be in the second bed on the left. You'll be sharing with two Flemish merchants and a guy named Thomas who snores." That was totally normal, and people didn't think twice about it. Privacy in sleep was basically a rich person's luxury. Royals and nobles had their grand beds, often in chambers surrounded by attendants who might literally be sleeping on the floor nearby. But he also had attendants sleeping right outside the curtains, in case His Majesty needed something in the night, like a drink of water or a change of pajamas, or, knowing Henry, maybe just an audience for his midnight complaints. Now, speaking of royals and nobles, they turned sleep into a performance. Take Louis XIV, the Sun King of France. He had something called the lever and coucher, his ceremonial waking and sleeping. Nobles would literally gather around to watch him go to bed. Yes, watch him go to bed. Picture it, Louis in his nightshirt, surrounded by courtiers who were desperate to hand him his slippers or tuck him in, because that gave them political clout. Honestly, nothing screams absolute monarchy. Quite like having 30 people fight over who gets to pass you your pillow. But while Louis was luxuriating in silk sheets, the average Parisian was sleeping on a straw mattress in a drafty room, probably with 3 other family members, plus fleas, because history, as usual, loves its contrasts. Now, bedding itself had a life cycle. Mattresses stuffed with straw or feathers would eventually attract lice, fleas, and all sorts of lovely creatures. So, people would air their beds by dragging them outside, beating them, or even leaving them in the sun. If you were very unlucky, you'd discover that mice or rats had moved in. Yes, imagine pulling back your blanket and finding a tiny roommate who pays no rent. Pillows were also controversial. In ancient Greece and Rome, some people thought using pillows was decadent, even weak. A real man, apparently, should just sleep flat on the ground, neck craned at a horrifying angle. Comfort was suspicious, which, to be fair, is a theme in a lot of history. All right, I think that's a good place to pause for now. We've floated from caveman bedding through Egyptian mosquito nets, Roman futons, medieval segmented sleep, and Louis XIV's bedtime entourage. And that's just the beginning. In the next part, we'll drift further into the weirdness, night terrors, dream interpretations, the absolute filth of medieval sheets, and the joys of candlelit midnight snacks. So, settle back, adjust your blanket, and let's keep unraveling the very cozy, very strange history of sleep. So, we left off with Louis XIV having 30 people fight over his pillow-fluffing rights, while most of the world was just trying not to wake up next to a rat. Let's wander gently into what came after people actually fell asleep. Because if you thought going to bed in the past was weird, the night itself was weirder. Remember that thing I mentioned earlier, segmented sleep? Yeah, that first sleep and second sleep deal. Well, the middle of the night, that little intermission wasn't just for tossing and turning. People used it. They planned for it. In medieval Europe, after first sleep, folks often got up for what was called the watch. You might say a few prayers. You might stoke the fire so you didn't freeze to death. Or you might just hang out and chat with your bedmates, which, again, could be your whole extended family. Imagine the scene. Half the household, groggy-eyed, mumbling in the dark, maybe gnawing on some leftover bread. It was like an accidental 2 a.m. slumber party, minus Netflix. And yes, this was also a popular time for marital activities. Apparently, fertility manuals in the late Middle Ages even recommended the middle of the night as prime baby-making hours, because nothing sets the mood like climbing over your snoring uncle and stepping around the family dog to find your spouse in the dark. Now, about those midnight snacks. Without fridges or late-night DoorDash, options were limited. But people did nibble. A hunk of bread, some cheese, maybe some ale. Ale, by the way, was safer than water in many places, so yes, even your sleepy grandmother might have washed down her midnight biscuit with a mug of warm beer. And before you cringe, just remember, in 2025, some of us still eat cold pizza in the dark. So honestly, not that different. But sleep wasn't all cozy snacking and pillow talk. It was also terrifying. Enter nightmares, or as medieval people called them, night terrors, caused by demons or witches. The classic image of a little goblin sitting on your chest while you can't breathe. That comes from actual medieval folklore. They believed evil spirits literally sat on your ribcage and pressed the air out of you, which, to be fair, is a very poetic way to describe sleep paralysis. There's even a German word for it, Albdruck, meaning elf pressure, because, of course, the logical explanation was that a cranky elf had decided to body slam you at 3 a.m. People took this seriously. If you had recurring night terrors, you might sprinkle holy water on your bed, hang charms, or even sleep with a knife under your pillow. Not for defense in the modern sense, but to scare off demons. Nothing like stabbing your mattress to remind the evil spirits who's boss. Now, let's drift into the very delicate topic of cleanliness, or, more accurately, the lack of it. Sheets, blankets, and mattresses were not exactly washed on a regular basis. In fact, some households washed their sheets only a few times a year, if that. Linen was expensive, water was a hassle, and soap was not great. So imagine crawling into your bed at night and basically marinating in a mixture of sweat, body oils, and the occasional flea. Delicious. Rich people had fancier sheets, often embroidered and perfumed, but they still didn't wash them as often as you'd like to imagine. Queen Elizabeth I, for instance, was said to have a horror of bathing, which means, yes, her royal sheets were probably carrying more history than her entire court. Speaking of royalty, let's talk about the strange obsession with bed curtains. Noble beds often came with heavy, thick curtains that you could draw around the mattress, turning the bed into a little fabric cave. On the practical side, this helped keep out drafts. But it also created privacy, or at least the illusion of it, in rooms that were usually crammed with attendants, and sometimes the curtains weren't even for the sleeper. They were for everyone else, so they didn't have to watch the king drool. Of course, this backfired. Heavy curtains plus open flames from candles equals occasional house fires. More than one noble family probably woke up to find their luxurious bed cave turning into an actual inferno. So, yes, even in bed, history found a way to be both fancy and unsafe. Now, let's take a detour into dreams, because if you woke up in the middle of the night, chances are you'd tell someone about your dream. And in the past, dreams weren't just your brain-cleaning house. They were important. The ancient Egyptians had dream books, little manuals that explained what your dream symbols meant. Dreamed about a crocodile, bad omen. Dreamed about eating, good omen. Dreamed about your teeth falling out. Well, congratulations. You just invented the most universal anxiety dream in human history. In the Middle Ages, dreams were often seen as messages from God or warnings from saints. People wrote them down, shared them, and even used them in decision-making. Imagine rolling out of bed at 2 a.m., telling your neighbor, "Well, I dreamed of a fat ox, so I think I'll plant barley this year." And your neighbor just nodding seriously like, "Yeah, sounds right." Meanwhile, ordinary people had another very practical nighttime problem: vermin. Fleas and lice were so common they were basically part of the furniture. Bed bugs existed too, though they were more discreet in colder climates. And then there were rodents. Cats helped, but not enough. So, if you were lying awake during your watch, you might hear the sound of tiny paws scurrying across your rafters. If you were unlucky, you'd feel them in your blanket. And yet, people still managed to sleep, which is either proof of human adaptability or proof that everyone was just perpetually exhausted. Probably both. Let's float back now to something a little cozier: the role of the hearth. Fires weren't just for warmth. They were also like a nightlight. Families often kept embers glowing through the night, so when they woke during their midnight intermission, the house wasn't pitch black. You might poke the fire, maybe add a log, maybe just sit and watch the glow for a bit before crawling back under your scratchy blanket. That glowing hearth, combined with the sound of night animals outside, created the soundtrack of medieval sleep. Not silence, not white noise, but crackles, snores, and the occasional chicken making confused midnight noises in the corner. All right. Let's pause here for now. We've drifted through segmented sleep schedules, midnight cheese feasts, demon-induced chest pressing, sheets that basically never saw soap, and the soothing glow of the fire. In the next part, we'll wander into even stranger territory: how cities dealt with sleep, why monks woke themselves up in the middle of the night on purpose, and the wonderfully bizarre inventions people came up with just to get a decent nap. So, stay tucked in, and let's keep floating through the night. So, we've survived fleas, rats, and Elizabeth I's probably radioactive bed linens. Let's glide gently onward to see how sleep changed when people started cramming themselves into towns and cities. Because yes, if you think sleeping in a medieval village was hard, wait until you try napping in 14th century Paris. First, the noise. Cities in the past weren't quiet. No cars, true. But you had carts rattling on cobblestones, dogs barking, drunk men singing, and bells ringing at random hours. The church bell, by the way, was the medieval version of your phone alarm, endlessly loud, always at the worst possible time, and impossible to snooze. Some cities had official curfews. The town bell would toll, and technically, you were supposed to go indoors, douse your fire, and stay put until morning. Did people follow this rule? Of course not. People wandered around anyway, which is why night watchmen existed. These were the unlucky souls who had to patrol the streets, carrying lanterns, sticks, and a general sense of irritation. Imagine trying to sleep through that. You're on your lumpy straw mattress, halfway through your first sleep, and outside your window some guy is yelling about pickpockets while a donkey refuses to move. Dreamy. Now, let's talk about monks, because if anyone perfected the art of weird sleep schedules, it was them. Medieval monasteries had something called the Divine Office, a set of prayers that had to be said at specific times of the day and night, which meant monks intentionally woke themselves up in the middle of the night. Around midnight or 2 a.m., the bell would ring and the monks would shuffle into the chapel to chant in the dark. Then they'd go back to bed for a little while, wake up again before dawn, pray again, and so on. Basically, monks were professional sleep disruptors. Their entire schedule was one long battle against REM cycles, and they considered this holy, because apparently nothing brings you closer to God than being chronically sleep-deprived. And yes, this influenced ordinary people too. In towns near monasteries, you might hear those bells at night. So even if you weren't particularly devout, your sleep was still being casually interrupted by Brother Matthew and his midnight hymn practice. Now, let's glide over to something a little cozier. What people wore to bed. For most of history, the answer is not much. Many peasants just slept in their day clothes. Stripping down was a luxury when your only other option was freezing to death in an unheated house. Plus, why waste time? Just collapse fully dressed. The wealthy, of course, had nightshirts. In medieval Europe, these were long linen gowns, basically identical to your regular underclothes, except labeled for sleeping. Gender wasn't a huge factor here. Men and women alike wore the same long flowing shirt, which means, yes, your dashing medieval knight probably snoozed in what looks like a loose grandma nightie. As time went on, wealthier sleepers began to branch out. By the 17th century, the trend of nightgowns spread across Europe. Fancy robes made of silk, velvet, or cotton, if you could afford imports. They weren't always just for bed either. You could lounge in them, entertain close friends in them, maybe even receive important visitors, while technically still in your pajamas. Early modern multitasking at its finest. And then, pajamas. These came to Europe through cultural exchange with South Asia in the 18th and 19th centuries. Loose trousers and a matching tunic, lightweight and breathable. Europeans saw this and thought, yes, this is the dream. Goodbye, scratchy linen sacks. Hello, comfort. Of course, at first they were considered exotic leisure wear, and only much later did they become standard bedtime clothing. So, next time you pull on your plaid pajama bottoms, just know you're actually participating in a centuries-old trend sparked by British colonials who finally realized that maybe sleeping in a stiff wool shirt wasn't the pinnacle of human achievement. Speaking of comfort, or lack of it, let's address the issue of heat, or more specifically, the lack of central heating in almost all of history. How did people stay warm in bed before radiators and electric blankets? Layering, piles of blankets, cloaks, furs, or even spare clothing. Beds in wealthy houses could weigh down the sleeper with so many layers that rolling over was basically impossible. You didn't toss and turn. You just accepted your fate as a very well-preserved sandwich. Poor households, meanwhile, relied on body heat. Everyone piled in together under one or two blankets, hoping for the best, which sure kept you warm. But it also meant sharing fleas, snores, and the occasional kick to the ribs. Romantic. Some clever folks used bed warmers, basically a metal pan filled with hot coals, which you slid under the covers before getting in. Theoretically, this made your bed toasty. In reality, sometimes it set your sheets on fire. Nothing says Sweet dreams like realizing you're basically lying on a slow-motion barbecue. Another delightful invention, the nightcap. Not the cocktail, though honestly, that also helped people sleep, but the literal hat. Imagine a floppy pointed cap, sometimes with a little tassel, designed to keep your head warm while you slept in an icy room. Yes, the classic cartoon image of Ebenezer Scrooge in his nightshirt and pointy hat. That wasn't a joke. People really did that, and they wore socks too. So the whole bundle up like a Victorian grandpa aesthetic was genuinely practical. Now back to the city problem. Urban sleep was messy, not just because of noise, but also because of nightlife. Taverns stayed open late. Prostitution was common. People wandered streets long after curfew, gambling, drinking, and sometimes picking fights. Which means if you lived in the city, you might be woken by shouts, or by someone knocking at your door, or by your neighbor's suspiciously loud midnight visitor. Rural life was quieter, sure, but it also came with wolves howling outside your hut. Honestly, there was no winning. One more thing worth mentioning here, beds as status symbols. In many households, the bed was the single most expensive piece of furniture you owned. It wasn't just for sleep. It was a prop, a display of wealth, even a family heirloom. Beds were passed down in wills. They were paraded in dowries. In some cases, they were so big and elaborate that moving them was practically impossible. And if you were a royal, your bed wasn't just furniture, it was a stage. We already talked about Louis XIV's bedtime ceremonies, but he wasn't the only one. Monarchs across Europe treated their beds like thrones, the place where they held audiences, made important decisions, and occasionally, yes, pretended to sleep, while courtiers fought over who got to hold the candle. So, while you and I use beds primarily for, well, sleeping, to our ancestors, a bed could be a political statement, a giant, creaky, bug-infested political statement. All right, I think we can pause here. We've drifted through noisy medieval cities, prayer-obsessed monks, pajama history, Scrooge-approved nightcaps, and beds as literal status symbols. Next, we'll glide into the deeper end. Why some people thought too much sleep was sinful, how early doctors prescribed the correct amount of rest, and the strange role of sleep in medicine and magic. So, tuck in, adjust your floppy hat, and let's keep unraveling the history of sleep. So, we've wandered through noisy city nights, shivering monks, and pajama evolution. Now let's drift into the stranger corners of history, where sleep wasn't just practical, it was moral, medical, and occasionally magical. First, let's tackle the idea that too much sleep was suspicious. For most of history, laziness was a sin. Sleeping in? Definitely suspicious. Early Christian writers were particularly harsh about it. They lumped oversleeping together with gluttony and lust. Basically, if you enjoyed your bed too much, you were spiritually doomed. Monks had a field day with this. They were already getting up at midnight to chant. So naturally, they thought anyone who slept through sunrise was basically in league with the devil. Manuals from the Middle Ages literally warned that the devil enters through idleness, which translated means don't snooze that rooster alarm. Of course, the irony is that many kings, nobles, and bishops were famous for sleeping in, sometimes until noon. But hey, rules were for peasants. Now, on to medicine. For ancient doctors, sleep wasn't just a bodily function, it was a treatment. Hippocrates, our favorite Greek father of medicine, believed sleep could rebalance the humors. Those delightful bodily fluids everyone was obsessed with for centuries. Too much phlegm? Try a nap. Melancholy? Sleep it off. Blood problems? Well, bloodletting, then a nap. Roman physicians also recommended sleep at certain times of day, but not too much, because, again, excess was bad. Everything in moderation, including unconsciousness. By the medieval period, doctors still tied sleep to humors. They advised different sleep positions depending on your ailments. For example, left side sleeping was thought to squish your heart. Bad idea. Right side, much better. Balanced digestion. Divine approval. On your back? Risky because demons might get you. Yes, really. On your stomach? Apparently, that encouraged sinful dreams. So if you woke up after an unfortunate medieval wet dream, you had only yourself and your sleeping position to blame. Let's float over to another medical quirk. Sleep cures. Doctors often prescribed long rest for the sick. But since long rest usually meant lying on your bug-infested straw mattress in a smoky room with poor ventilation, this probably didn't help much. Still, people believed in it. Entire convalescence periods were basically enforced nap times. On the flip side, some doctors also prescribed less sleep if you were too sluggish, because apparently nothing solved anemia like waking up at dawn to do manual labor, which, to be fair, may have just been code for stop being poor. Now, let's dip into magic, because if you lived in the past and couldn't sleep, there weren't exactly melatonin gummies waiting on your nightstand. Instead, you turned to charms, prayers, or straight-up witchcraft. Common remedies included placing a Bible under your pillow, classic multi-purpose protection, wearing amulets with herbs like rosemary or lavender, honestly, not the worst idea, writing certain psalms on parchment, then tucking it into your sheets, which is basically the medieval version of a sleep app playlist. Of course, not everyone used wholesome charms. Some leaned into the darker side. Folk healers in Europe recommended drinking weird concoctions, like wine mixed with poppy seeds or lettuce juice. Yes, lettuce. Apparently, lettuce was considered mildly soporific. So, somewhere in medieval France, a tired farmer was chugging salad smoothies just to knock himself out. And then there was opium. Ancient Greeks, Romans, Persians, Chinese, all used it as a sleep aid. Effective? Absolutely. Safe? Not at all. But when your other option was lying awake listening to rats chew on your rafters, I can see the appeal. Dreams, too, fell into the category of magic meets medicine. We talked earlier about dream interpretation, but it wasn't just personal. Whole communities believed dreams could predict plagues, famines, or political events. Priests and wise women made a living as dream interpreters. And if your dreams were particularly bad, that meant either demons were after you or your body was out of balance. Sometimes both. Basically, if you dreamed about falling into a pit of snakes, you needed both a priest and a doctor. But let's not forget, sleep was also deeply practical. Farmers structured their entire lives around it. If the sun went down at 4 p.m. in winter, they might get their first sleep before 8 p.m., wake around midnight, then do little chores by candlelight before second sleep. In summer, with long days, they might nap in the afternoon instead. The idea of one rigid sleep schedule simply didn't exist. Even nobles and kings adapted. They had long banquets, late-night plotting sessions, or very early morning hunts. Sleep was squeezed in where it could fit, sometimes in multiple naps, which means, in a weird way, our modern obsession with proper sleep hygiene would have baffled them. For most of history, you just slept when you could. And speaking of nobles, let's float back to them for a second. Because if you want to find the weirdest sleep-related habits, royalty never disappoints. Take Charles the Ninth of France. He supposedly suffered terrible insomnia. To help him sleep, his doctors recommended playing soft music in his chambers at night, which is fine until you realize this meant actual musicians sitting in the room with him while he tried to nod off. Imagine being a lute player, paid to strum lullabies for a king, desperately trying not to sneeze in the dark while His Majesty twitched. Or Frederick the Great of Prussia. He was obsessed with discipline and efficiency, but also terrified of missing sleep. His letters complain endlessly about insomnia. He had elaborate routines with warm milk, herbal infusions, and very strict bedtimes, which sounds normal until you remember he was running a European empire. Nothing like conquering Silesia, then panicking because you didn't get your recommended 7 hours. And then there were those rulers who just didn't get the memo. Napoleon famously claimed he needed only 4 hours of sleep, which is the sort of macho nonsense leaders always say. In reality, witnesses reported him dozing off constantly during carriage rides, dinners, even meetings. Because, spoiler alert, biology wins. Meanwhile, other rulers leaned the opposite way. Spanish King Philip II was notorious for his love of naps. Courtiers grumbled that he spent half the day in bed, which honestly sounds less like sloth and more like the man had discovered the one true perk of absolute monarchy. All right, let's gently pause here. We floated through sin, medicine, lettuce juice, opium, and kings with personal bedtime orchestras. In the next part, we'll explore how people in different cultures, from the Ottoman Empire to Japan to the Americas, approach sleep. Spoiler: it wasn't all bugs and drafty castles. Some societies actually invented things we'd recognize as kind of genius. So, fluff your pillow, sip your imaginary medieval lettuce juice, and let's keep drifting along. So far, we've mostly been wandering through European castles, monasteries, and peasant huts. But of course, people all over the world were doing their own equally fascinating and sometimes far more comfortable things when
Let's
it came
start
to
with
sleep.
the Ottoman Empire. If medieval Europe was scratching straw and hoping fleas wouldn't bite too hard, the Ottomans were basically inventing what we'd recognize as the cozy, cushioned bed. Ottoman homes often had entire rooms lined with divans, those raised wooden platforms covered with cushions, carpets, and bolsters. During the day, these were for lounging and drinking endless cups of coffee. At night, bedding would be brought out. Quilts, blankets, pillows. People could sleep communally or roll into a corner if they wanted privacy. It was flexible, social, and, frankly, way more comfortable than a European straw tick. Ottoman elites also had an endless fascination with luxurious fabrics. Silks, brocades, and embroidery turned the act of sleeping into something closer to a fashion statement. And unlike Europe's obsession with sin and sleep discipline, the Ottomans fully embraced naps. Afternoon siestas were entirely normal, especially given the climate. Imagine how smug they'd feel if they knew modern sleep scientists now tell us a 20-minute nap is healthy. Now, let's float east to Japan. Here, sleep was radically different. No towering four-posters, no feather mattresses, just futons, thin cotton mattresses laid directly on tatami mats. At first glance, this might sound uncomfortable to someone used to soft beds. But tatami provided cushioning, and futons could be easily folded away, saving space. The Japanese home wasn't built for giant furniture. It was built for flexibility. Privacy wasn't a huge concern either. Families often slept together in the same room, sometimes with children wedged between parents. Warmth, after all, was more important than independence. And here's the thing. Modern health experts actually praise this style. Sleeping low to the ground on firm bedding can help posture. So while Europeans were twisting themselves into S-shaped feather beds, Japanese sleepers were aligning their spines like quiet yoga masters. Oh, and pillows? Not the fluffy cloud-like things we imagine. Traditional Japanese Makura pillows were often wooden or ceramic supports with a padded top. They weren't exactly comfy, but they had a practical purpose, keeping elaborate hairstyles intact overnight. Beauty sleep, taken literally, onward to China. Here, sleep was intertwined with deep philosophical and medical traditions. Confucian ideals emphasized order and moderation, which extended even to bedtime. The Chinese elite used raised wooden beds with canopies, often richly decorated with carvings. These weren't just furniture. They were symbolic spaces, blending practicality, status, and even spirituality. And of course, feng shui applied to sleep. Where you placed your bed mattered. Pointing it toward a doorway, bad luck. Sleeping under a beam, terrible energy. Sleeping with your head facing north, excellent. The alignment of your bed wasn't just interior design, it was believed to influence health, fortune, and even moral character. For ordinary Chinese families, things were simpler. Kang beds, brick or clay platforms heated from below by a fire, kept people warm in freezing northern winters. Families would pile onto these kangs, huddling together like cheerful dumplings steaming in a pot. Let's cross the ocean, the Americas, before European contact. Among many Native American groups, sleeping was closely tied to community and spirituality. In longhouses of the Iroquois, for example, multiple families lived together. Sleeping platforms lined the walls, layered with furs, mats, and blankets. Privacy wasn't the priority. Warmth and kinship were. For nomadic groups like the Plains tribes, sleep was about portability. Teepees allowed for central fires, and bedding could be rolled and carried easily. Buffalo hides served as mattresses and blankets, durable against the cold. And of course, dreams had deep spiritual meaning. For many native cultures, dreams were messages, visions, or even journeys. To sleep was not just to rest. It was to touch the sacred. The famous dream catcher has its roots here. Woven hoops meant to filter out nightmares while letting good dreams through. And in South America, the Maya and Inca had their own traditions. The Maya are credited with using hammocks, a brilliant invention, lightweight, airy, and suspended above the ground where bugs and snakes couldn't reach you. Hammocks spread throughout the Caribbean and Central America, and when Europeans encountered them, they were baffled and then instantly hooked. Sailors in particular adopted hammocks because they worked perfectly on swaying ships. Imagine being a 15th century Spaniard, used to lumpy straw mattresses, suddenly seeing someone floating peacefully in a hammock. It must have felt like witchcraft. And finally, let's peek into Africa. Across the continent, sleeping arrangements varied wildly. Nomadic groups like the Tuareg of the Sahara used mats that could be rolled and moved daily. In humid regions, raised platforms or hammocks kept sleepers above insects. Among settled communities, family compounds often had communal sleeping quarters. Privacy wasn't the concern. Protection and togetherness were. And as in many cultures, sleep was tied to spirits. Nightmares weren't just bad brain chemistry.
They were visitations. Ancestors, gods, or demons might whisper through dreams. African herbal traditions also included remedies for insomnia, infusions of roots, bark, or leaves. Some of these were mildly sedative, others more symbolic. Either way, sleep was recognized as vital to health and spiritual balance. So, what do we learn from this global tour? That Europe's drafty castles and flea-bitten beds were just one version of human sleep. Around the world, people invented hammocks, heated platforms, futons, divans, and whole spiritual systems around bedtime. Sleep wasn't just a biological necessity, it was a mirror of culture, climate, and belief. And, dare I say, most of them probably had a better night's rest than a medieval peasant scratching in the hay. All right, let's gently pause here. We've gone global, drifted through hammocks, futons, and kang beds. In the next part, we'll return to the big question, how did we end up with our modern obsession with the 8-hour single-block sleep schedule? Spoiler, it's surprisingly recent and fueled by capitalism, factories, and a lot of grumpy Victorians. So, fluff your futon, swing gently in your hammock, and prepare to drift into Part 6. We've wandered through hammocks, kang beds, futons, and flea-infested straw piles. But now, let's drift into the moment history decided to reshape sleep itself. The culprit? The Industrial Revolution. Before factories, clocks didn't matter much. Peasants worked with the sun. Farmers rose when light hit the fields and rested when it disappeared. Towns had bells to mark prayers or curfews, but the exact hour, nobody cared. Time was natural, flexible, and elastic. Then came machines, loud, clunky smokestack machines, and machines don't really care if you're tired. They need workers in place, on the dot, every morning. Enter the factory whistle, humanity's first loud mechanical alarm clock. Sleep became less about listening to your body and more about obeying a shift schedule. And of course, artificial light changed everything. For centuries, your only option after sunset was firelight, candles, oil lamps, and hearths. Expensive, smoky, dim. That meant sleep followed darkness, like it or not. But gas lamps started spreading in cities in the 18th century. Suddenly, streets glowed. Shops stayed open later. People stayed awake just because they could. And then, in the 19th century, Edison and his light bulb really messed with bedtime. The night was no longer scary and short. It was infinite. And humans, given the choice, will usually choose just one more hour. We still do it, except instead of candles and gas lamps, it's TikTok and Netflix. Segmented sleep disappeared. Remember how medieval people liked their 2-part nights? Sleep, wake, pray, gossip, then sleep again? By the 19th century, that pattern began fading. Factories demanded early rising, artificial light, extended evenings. The result was a push toward what doctors and reformers began calling consolidated sleep. One long block, ideally 7 to 8 hours. The irony is, this modern sleep model is actually the weird one, historically speaking. Most of humanity, for most of history, had broken or segmented sleep. But Victorians loved uniformity. They also loved telling people how to live properly. So, of course, they decided single-block sleep was more rational. Beds got fancier and more private. Middle-class Victorians poured money into the bedroom. Furniture makers advertised solid, imposing bedsteads as a sign of respectability. Iron and brass frames became popular, partly to avoid bed bugs and partly because nothing says we are very proper like a giant bed frame that takes up half the room. Privacy also exploded as a concept. wealthier families started having separate bedrooms, or at least separate beds, within the same room. Doctors even encouraged this, suggesting that sleeping together was unhealthy. Sharing body heat, unsanitary. Sharing air, dangerous. Victorian morality added another layer. Too much nighttime contact might lead to, well, too much reproduction. So, two beds it was. It's ironic. For centuries, couples, kids, servants, and strangers all slept in heaps together. By the late 19th century, the ideal became crisp, private beds with strict boundaries. Progress, apparently, meant more loneliness at night. Sleep became a moral issue. The Victorians were obsessed with discipline, hard work, productivity, no laziness allowed. Sleep, naturally, became a moral battlefield.
Doctors wrote advice manuals insisting that 8 hours of sleep was necessary. Not too little, not too much. Oversleeping was condemned as sloth. Insomnia, on the other hand, was a sign of weak nerves or moral failing. Basically, you couldn't win. Some reformers even suggested regulating sleep like a diet. Early to bed, early to rise. Not because it was healthy, but because it kept workers punctual and efficient. Benjamin Franklin's old motto, "Early to bed and early to rise makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise," was dragged out constantly, usually by people who wanted you back on the factory floor at 6 a.m. And let's not forget the role of caffeine. Coffee houses had already boomed in the 17th and 18th centuries, but industrial society turned caffeine into rocket fuel. Workers downed tea and coffee to stay alert on long shifts. Factory owners literally encouraged it. A cheap stimulant was better than sleepy workers around heavy machinery. It was the beginning of what we now take for granted. Societies running on caffeine during the day, then collapsing at night. Before, alcohol had been the everyday beverage. Now, tea at breakfast and coffee at work kept everyone buzzing just enough to ignore their exhaustion. Sleep in cities versus countryside. Urban life meant noise, constant noise. Factory whistles, carriage wheels, horses, shouting vendors, and eventually trains rattling through the night. Rural people still followed more traditional patterns, but city dwellers had to adjust. Bedrooms were rarely quiet, and blackout curtains weren't yet common. Sleep became lighter, more fragmented, and often shorter. And yet, Victorians doubled down on preaching about perfect sleep hygiene. Advice columns told readers to sleep exactly 8 hours in pure darkness, in fresh country air, with no disturbances. In other words, they were asking for the impossible. Insomnia as a modern disease. By the late 19th century, doctors began writing about insomnia epidemics. City life, industrial schedules, artificial light, caffeine, and stress combined to make sleeplessness a real problem. Medical journals debated whether insomnia was caused by weak nerves, too much reading, or overstimulation from city living. There was even an early sleep industry. People tried herbal tonics, sleeping drafts, or fancy devices meant to improve rest. Sound familiar? Yep. Victorians basically invented the idea of monetizing bad sleep. So, to sum it up, the Industrial Revolution turned sleep into a commodity. It shifted humans from natural rhythms to strict schedules. It invented the idea of the perfect 8 hours. It made sleep private, moralized, and medicalized. And it created problems, like widespread insomnia, that we're still wrestling with today. And, let's be honest, if medieval peasants could see us scrolling on glowing rectangles at 3 a.m., they'd probably shake their straw-filled heads and mutter something about
How dumb progress can be. All right, let's let this sink in. In the next part, we'll drift into the 20th century, where sleep meets modern science, sleep labs, Freud's dream theories, and the rise of the mattress industry. Basically, the moment when your bed became a capitalist battleground between Sealy, Simmons, and Serta. So close your eyes, ignore the factory whistle in the distance, and float with me into Part 7. So, the 20th century. Electricity is everywhere. Factories are humming, and people are sleeping less. Naturally, this is when scientists and entrepreneurs start circling around the bed like vultures. Because if there's one thing modernity loves, it's turning basic human needs into a research project and a marketing opportunity. Sleep becomes a science experiment. Before 1900, sleep was mostly seen as boring downtime. Doctors wrote pamphlets, priests gave sermons, philosophers shrugged. But in the early 20th century, neurologists and psychologists started poking around with electrodes, trying to measure what actually happens when we close our eyes. By the 1920s, scientists discovered brain waves. Suddenly, sleep wasn't just unconsciousness. It had stages: light sleep, deep sleep, dream sleep. The real breakthrough came in 1953, when researchers Oserinsky and Kleitman identified REM sleep. That's rapid eye movement, the stage when dreams are most vivid. It was a huge deal. Humans weren't just shutting down at night. We were running complex cycles, recharging in layers like a biological phone battery. Of course, most people didn't care. They still just wanted a decent nap. But science now had its hooks in. Enter Freud, king of overthinking dreams. Sigmund Freud, the Viennese neurologist turned psychologist, published The Interpretation of Dreams in 1900. He declared that dreams were the royal road to the unconscious, which is a very Freudian way of saying, your brain is a messy attic full of embarrassing secrets, and sleep is when they crawl out. To Freud, dreams weren't random. They were coded messages about repressed desires, usually involving your parents, and usually uncomfortably weird. The idea caught fire because who doesn't want to psychoanalyze their nightmares about showing up to work naked? Not everyone bought it, of course. But for decades, Freud's dream theories dominated popular culture. People kept dream journals, tried to decode symbols, and treated nightmares like therapy homework, which, honestly, probably made insomnia worse. Nothing like lying awake at night worrying that your dream about a train was secretly about your mother. The rise of the mattress industry. Meanwhile, outside the lab, capitalism was busy transforming the bed itself. In the late 19th century, springs had already replaced lumpy straw sacks for middle-class sleepers. By the 20th century, big brands like Sealy, Simmons, and Serta launched the first mattress empires. They plastered magazines with ads promising scientifically designed sleep. Simmons introduced the Beauty Rest in 1925 with individual pocketed coils. It was expensive, but they marketed it as an investment in health. You spend a third of your life in bed, the ad said. Shouldn't it be the best third? Which sounds nice until you remember most people were still sleeping in cramped apartments with paper-thin walls. By mid-century, beds were becoming status symbols. Suburban families showed off their giant spring mattresses like trophies. The old straw tick? Embarrassing. Proper adults now slept on branded, trademarked, coil-counted marvels. Bedrooms get redesigned. The 20th century also reimagined the bedroom as a private sanctuary. In earlier centuries, bedrooms doubled as social spaces. You received visitors in bed, gave birth in bed, sometimes even signed political treaties in bed. But by the 1900s, the bedroom became a strictly personal zone. No guests, no politics, just sleep, intimacy, and rest. Magazines pushed the idea of coordinated bedroom sets, matching nightstands, sleek lamps, curtains that blocked streetlights. Companies sold not just mattresses, but entire sleep environments. The bed wasn't just furniture anymore, it was lifestyle. Sleep problems go mainstream. With urbanization and stressful modern jobs, insomnia skyrocketed. Doctors diagnosed neurasthenia, a catch-all for fatigue, restlessness, and inability to sleep. It was blamed on telegraphs, trains, typewriters, basically every new technology. By mid-century, pills entered the scene. Barbiturates, and later benzodiazepines, became the go-to prescription for sleeplessness. Millions of people quietly knocked themselves out each night with pharmaceuticals. Doctors promised these were safe, modern solutions. Spoiler, many weren't. Addiction rates rose, and sleeping pills developed a reputation as both miracle and menace. Sleep as productivity fuel. By the late 20th century, sleep was less about health and more about optimization. Self-help books insisted that successful people woke up early. CEOs bragged about running on 4 hours a night. Napping was condemned as laziness. The goal wasn't comfort, it was efficiency. And yet, irony of ironies, sleep science at the same time was proving how vital rest was for memory, mood, and even survival. Decades of research showed sleep deprivation wrecked your body and brain. But modern work culture still pushed the idea that sleeping less was heroic, which is how we got grind culture, the absolute enemy of a cozy bedtime. Dreams versus reality. By the end of the century, humanity had achieved a bizarre paradox. We knew more about sleep than ever before. We had luxury mattresses, pills, blackout curtains, and entire industries devoted to bedtime. And yet, surveys showed people were sleeping less, reporting more insomnia, and feeling more tired than their ancestors. In other words, we'd turned rest into work. So, to recap this little century, Freud made everyone suspicious of their dreams. Scientists wired up sleepers with electrodes. Mattress companies turned beds into gadgets. Doctors handed out pills like candy. And the culture told you that needing sleep was weakness. Progress, right? Take a deep breath. Let's let Freud go back to analyzing his cigar dreams and drift into the final chapter. Because in Part 8, we'll enter the 21st century, the era of blue light, biohacking, and billion-dollar sleep tech. So fluff your pillow, because the story of human sleep is about to end exactly where we started, lying awake at night, wondering why we can't just drift off like our ancestors in their itchy straw beds. So, here we are, the 21st century, a time when we have memory foam, blackout curtains, melatonin gummies, and an entire Netflix documentary series telling us how important sleep is. And yet, almost no one is actually sleeping enough. Classic.
See, once electricity fully conquered the night, we officially entered the age of sleep procrastination. In medieval times, you stayed up because the fire was still going, or because someone was telling ghost stories in the tavern. Now, we stay up because we've decided to watch just one more episode of something, which of course means 3 more, because the streaming platform automatically plays the next one before you can even think about going to bed. And yes, you could technically press pause and go to sleep. But let's be honest, you won't. Nobody ever does. Blue light became the new candle flame.
The glow of your phone, tablet, or laptop screen tells your brain, hey buddy, it's daytime. Don't even think about melatonin right now. So instead of winding down, your poor circadian rhythm is basically being smacked in the face with virtual daylight at midnight, which is why sleep doctors now sound like medieval monks, except instead of telling you to pray before bed, they tell you to put your phone away at least an hour before sleeping, which we all ignore, obviously. Meanwhile, sleep became a billion-dollar industry. There are apps that track your sleep cycles, smart watches that vibrate when you're in light sleep so you wake up refreshed, and mattresses that promise to literally change your life. Apparently, we've reached the point where a mattress is no longer just a mattress. It's sleep technology. For thousands of years, people managed with straw, dirt floors, or just an animal hide. But today, if your mattress doesn't have at least 3 layers of memory foam, cooling gel, and NASA-level engineering, you're basically a medieval peasant. And then there are supplements. Melatonin gummies taste suspiciously like candy, so it's hard to tell if we're improving sleep or just giving adults an excuse to eat bedtime sweets. Herbal teas, lavender sprays, magnesium capsules. It's basically the modern equivalent of medieval sleep charms. Except now it comes in shiny packaging with wellness influencers telling you to prioritize rest. Of course, even as people buy sleep tech, they're sleeping less than ever. In fact, researchers coined the phrase sleep debt to describe how modern humans are constantly borrowing hours from the night to spend them scrolling, working, or binge-watching, only to wake up groggy and confused like an 18th century sailor who fell asleep on watch. The irony is, we're probably the only society in history that reads entire books and listens to podcasts about how to sleep, while staying up late to do it. Past people didn't analyze their sleep. They just collapsed after a long day of labor and hoped rats didn't crawl on them. We, meanwhile, download 3 different apps to measure our REM cycles, and then panic when the data tells us we're not resting optimally. So, what does this tell us about the future of sleep? Well, probably that we'll keep inventing more gadgets, buying more overpriced pillows, and stressing about whether or not we're sleeping correctly, which ironically makes us sleep worse. But maybe there's a strange kind of comfort in realizing that across all of history, from cavemen on dirt floors to monks breaking their sleep for prayers, to Victorians panicking about insomnia, we've never really had it figured out. Humans have always struggled with the night, and no matter how many memory foam mattresses or lavender sprays we add, sleep will probably stay just a little mysterious. And now, with that thought, it's probably time to close your eyes, ignore your phone buzzing on the nightstand, and pretend that tonight you'll actually go to bed early. So good night, my sleepless historians, and may your dreams be slightly less weird than the lives of the people we just talked about.